Dean Stervitas, faculty, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you'd expect me to say it, but it really is an honor to be back here as you begin the new academic year. And as I was sitting over here in my chair looking at the first 3 rows, I couldn't help but feel like I'm on the wrong end of the podium here this morning. And so I thought I'd borrow a line and say, do you know what I'm going to talk about? and then just be done with it. But I am grateful to be recognized with the Class of 1947 Memorial Award. And without any false humility, when I consider the many accomplishments of Fletcher alumni, it's hard for me to feel deserving of the award, particularly an award from a class that in the United States is known as the greatest generation. That said, I'll use this occasion to re-energize my commitment to advance the founding ideals and the purpose of the Fletcher School. As you know, the primary aim of the school today is the same as it was in 1933, with an expectation that graduates will be committed to maintaining the stability and prosperity of a complex, challenging, and increasingly global society. And I see my profession as consistent with that mission. In a few minutes, I'll talk about what pursuing that end will mean to me over the next few years. But before I begin, I'd like to share a few personal thoughts about my Fletcher experience. I arrived here in 1991, and it was a pretty chaotic time for the Dunford family. We had 3 children. The oldest was 3, the middle child was not quite 2, and our youngest was 6 weeks old. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. It was off the Red Line. All the children shared a room that we affectionately called the birdcage. Now, not all of you have had children, but all of you have visited the zoo and been to the birdcage. What I would tell you is when one of our birds started to chirp, the whole house came alive. And sleep was a rare commodity. And I hesitate to tell you this, you know, after Dean Stervitas talked about the significance of today and all those words about what Convocation would mean. I hate to say this, and I hope you'll forgive me, but I actually don't remember Convocation. I do remember being herded into the room. I remember going out and taking a class photograph. I have no idea who the Convocation speaker was, let alone what he or she might have said. And that, of course, takes a lot of pressure off me this morning. But I do actually recall arriving with great enthusiasm. As the Dean mentioned, I grew up in the Boston area, and I knew what an extraordinary opportunity I was going to have here to study at Fletcher. I'd served 14 years in the Marine Corps when I arrived, and my previous assignments were mostly at the small unit level. And when I look back at my time here, it was actually a major inflection point in my career. Let me explain. When I talk to junior leaders in the Marine Corps, I tell them, you know, when I was a young officer, I thought I had all the answers. I thought I knew everything. And of course, I didn't have very much experience. And what I found is that as I've gone in my career, and I now have 38 years, and so I started as a second lieutenant, that's an entry-level position in our force, and the general is the most senior. And so some 38 years later, my experience and my confidence have actually gone in inverse. And today, I actually, you know, if as a lieutenant, my confidence was here and my experience was here, as I stand before you today, my confidence that I have all the answers is actually down here, and my experience is up here. And I would tell you that, in part, I attribute that to that dynamic to the faculty here at Fletcher, my fellow students, and the opportunity I had to read, to reflect, and to engage. Without hyperbole, my year at Fletcher shaped the cardinal direction of the remaining 23 years of my career. In Professor Schultz's classes, I was exposed to a framework for understanding national policy, and I began to look at conflict, defense, and strategic issues from a different perspective. My classwork was augmented by discussions with students who'd recently served in the Peace Corps, the United Nations, the business world, media, or in foreign services from countries across the globe. That foundation is particularly useful to me today as I actually have a position that's at the nexus of policy and strategy. So Professor Schultz, thank you. In Professor Hess's classes, I learned about the history, complexity, challenges, and opportunities in Southwest and Central Asia. And from Professor Hess and a visiting professor by the name of Esposito, I gained a much better appreciation for the role of Islam in the region. My classwork was augmented by my fellow students from countries like Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And that background was extraordinarily helpful to me during the time in Iraq that Dean Stervitas spoke about in my over a year and a half in Afghanistan. And then many times I've been in and out of the region since then. So, Professor Hess, thank you. In Professor Hannum's class, I began to appreciate international human rights and its role in the international political order. I was in a classroom with many students who you can imagine came at the issue with a much different passion and perspective than a Marine Corps major. That experience was invaluable over the past decade in my engagements with the United Nations in a wide range of non-governmental organizations committed to international human rights. It also helped how I think about conflict and conflict resolution. So Professor Hammond, thank you. And from the late Professor Keith Hyatt, a lawyer who handled more cases before the International Criminal Court of Justice than any other American, I learned about the international law of the sea. And I actually began to question why the United States hadn't signed the international law of the sea when I was a student here. And I've dealt with the law of the sea in many of my subsequent assignments. And so thank you, Professor Hyatt. And from Professor Hendrickson, I gained an appreciation for the history of U.S. foreign relations and the theory and practice of diplomacy, an art that is as important to a senior military leader as it is a diplomat. Professor Hendrickson, I think you're here as well. Thank you. You know, I could go on and I could and really speak at length about the faculty here, and I apologize for those professors I might have missed, but I think you get my point. My time at Fletcher fundamentally influenced how I look at the strategic landscape within which the United States and the international community engage. And it provided me with an understanding that has been invaluable as a military officer and a national security professional. I would briefly look back on my Fletcher experience. I'd like to spend the next few minutes looking forward. If I was a commencement speaker, I'd feel obligated to offer you some profound words of wisdom. But since this is the beginning of the year, I actually feel a little less pressure to do that. And I feel, kind of inclined to use the Socratic method and perhaps be just a little bit less definitive. I'm going to transition to my new job, as the Dean mentioned, at the end of this month. And in that role, I'll provide our President and members of the National Security Council with best military advice on a wide range of issues. Consistent with my earlier comments about having more questions than answers, here's some of the questions that I have as I prepare for my new duties. And I actually hope these questions will also maybe provide you some food for thought as you return to Fletcher or as you begin your experience here at Fletcher. Former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Kissinger described the current environment as the most volatile and complex security environment since World War II. And our current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, recently published our National Military Strategy, and he says similar words. And whether you fully agree with Kissinger's perspective or not, it's clear the United States and its partners currently face multiple simultaneous security challenges, from traditional state actors to trans-regional networks of sub-state groups. Other factors that characterize the security environment include globalization, rapid technological change, nuclear proliferation, demographic shifts, economic instability, and cyber threats. The overarching question that I have to answer in my next assignment is, how will the United States employ our military forces to protect and advance our national interests within the context of that environment? I'll also have to address how we'll rapidly adapt to new threats while dealing with traditional challenges, and how the military instrument will support other instruments of national power and enable our network of allies and partners. Let me begin to get after these broader questions by looking at some of the specific challenges we face. Today, the United States is leading a broad coalition of nations to defeat violent extremist organizations, to include Al-Qaeda and ISIL. These groups are focused on spreading violence and terror to impose their vision of what society should look like. And today, on the anniversary of 9/11, it's a reminder of what these groups seek to do. From my perspective, this is a generational struggle, and there is no purely military solution. To that point, there's actually 9 lines of effort in our current U.S. strategy against ISIL. 2 of those lines of effort are led by the Department of Defense. But the military dimension of the challenge is important, and we have to get that part right. Getting it right means integrating the military instrument with all elements of national power and our international partnerships. And our effort has to be sustainable politically, financially, and militarily. What does a sustainable strategy to deal with violent extremism look like? What resources, partnership, and posture will allow the U.S. military and coalition partners to effectively deny the enemy sanctuary and help to build the capacity of our partner nations? How can the military best support efforts to counter extremist messaging, interdict finances, impede the flow of foreign fighters, and disrupt threats to the homeland and to our partners? And of course, violent extremism is not the only challenge. Francis Fukuyama wrote "The End of History and the Last Man" while I was actually a student here at Fletcher. And he predicted the universalization of Western liberal democracy. In theory, that would reduce the probability of conflict between states. It would be an understatement to say that that hasn't happened. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have certainly resisted the trend towards Western liberal democracy. Russia has violated the sovereignty of its neighbors and demonstrated a willingness to use force to achieve its objectives. How can the military instrument address that behavior, assure our allies in Europe without the risk of escalation? What more can or should NATO do? In the current environment, how can we reestablish and leverage military-to-military relationships with Russia to minimize the risk of miscalculation? And how do we address the recent activity of Russia in Syria? The United States supports China's rise and encourages it to become a partner for greater international security. But recent Chinese actions, to include its claims in the South China Sea, have created tension in the region. How should the military instrument be used to assure our allies and partners in the region? What actions are appropriate to ensure continued access to the global commons? How do we leverage military-to-military relationships to support regional stability and mitigate the risk of miscalculation? In the wake of the P5+1 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what's the military dimension of a plan to deal with Iran's malign influence across the Middle East? What opportunities does the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action offer to establish military-to-military relations with Iran after actually decades without contact? Let me talk specifically about the U.S. military. The U.S. military has had a technological advantage over potential enemies for decades. Again, the world is changing. How do we incentivize and institutionalize innovation to maintain a competitive advantage? How do we deter, defend, and properly respond to the cyber threat? It should be no surprise that I'm proud of America's armed forces. I value the professionalism of our young men and women in uniform and the trust placed in them by the American people. How do we ensure that the U.S. military continues to attract the right high-quality people and remains respected and professional? And ladies and gentlemen, those are just a few of the questions that I have as I prepare for my new duties. Well, there's many more. These questions will give you some insight to my priorities as I prepare to look at our security challenges and opportunities with a fresh set of eyes. I hope it's clear from the questions and my comments that I believe today's challenge is multidimensional. While I necessarily focus on the military dimension, military solutions must complement and support the diplomatic and economic dimensions. And from my perspective, that point highlights the value of a Fletcher education. The experience here prepares you to address complex challenges in the real world. Let me close with a couple of messages to our new and returning students, if I can be presumptuous just for a minute. Most of you will become practitioners in government service, public service, or international business. And this year actually presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So my first message is probably something you'd expect to hear from a United States Marine: attack. Attack the opportunity to engage with a world-class faculty, ask the hard questions, and take full advantage of their education and insight. Attack the opportunity to engage with and learn from your fellow students. As has been mentioned before, you're an extraordinarily talented, accomplished, and diverse group. They're going to broaden your perspective, and I suspect, like me, you'll learn as much outside of the classroom this year as you will inside of the classroom. And attack the opportunity to think, to read, to write, challenge yourself. Take courses outside of your comfort zone. Carpe diem, seize the day. And finally, prepare to depart Fletcher, committed to meet the expectation of graduates that I mentioned at the outside of my remarks. With a Fletcher education, you'll be better prepared to make a difference. And in many ways, you leave here with an obligation to make a difference. Thanks again for the honor of joining you. I look forward to coming back during the academic year to get your thoughts on my questions, but probably as importantly, I look forward to coming back and getting some help in crafting some answers, which I'm probably due to have here soon. Semper Fidelis, all the best. Thank you.